So I want to focus on the site of Uruk Warka. It's Uruk in Mesopotamian, it's Warka in the modern Arabic, and in the Bible it's referred to as Biblical Erech. German excavations beginning in the 1920s started investigating the early dynastic remains, which are some of the largest and most visible remains in the southern Mesopotamian alluvium in southern Iraq today. Uh, but it's when they started excavating the early dynastic remains and they got below those materials, they recovered for the first time material evidence of the Uruk period. Uh, Early excavations focused on the Eanna Precinct here and the Anu Ziggurat complex here at the heart of the city. Uh, and as they kind of dug down, they were looking at the remains of these early dynastic temples. But what they've started to realize is as they kept digging, there was several successive layers of administrative and religious compounds that dated all the way back to the late Ubaid period. And the best understanding of the formation of the site of Uruk is likely the fact that two small Ubaid settlements, each of them with their own temple complexes to very specific deities, merged together to form the modern city or the ancient city of Uruk in the Uruk period. Now, in the early dynastic period, we know the city centers were dedicated to the moon god Nana over here at the Anu Ziggurat, built by Ornamu in the early dynastic period, and to the goddess, his twin sister Inanna, who's the goddess of love, fertility, and war. Inanna is incredibly important because she would later become to be known as Ishtar in the Babylonian, and as we approach Easter, we should kind of think about her because Easter is ultimately named for her fertility festivals at the beginning of spring. So Ishtar and Inanna here are incredibly important deities in the long-standing lineage of Mesopotamian worship. And so the two of these taken together, if we think back to the video you just watched, represent kind of the patron deities of the city, much like what we saw at Eridu in the early dynastic period being dedicated to the god Enki. And so we can kind of, it's tempting to look at this and read that back into the Ubaid period, but there's just too much time differential to say. But we do see the continuation of use of these spaces as sacred through this. So there's something very important about these locations for Mesopotamian religious practice that goes all the way back to the end of the late Ubaid, sometime around 4200 BCE, and continues for the next 2500 years. Now, here at the Anu Ziggurat, below it, as they started to excavate, the German team found what they called the White Temple. And this is a platform complex with a huge tripartite niched and buttressed temple with a circular offering table at one end of the central hall and a large niche opposite the central hall that likely housed a statue. In the early dynastic period, from cuneiform documents and texts, we know that this would have been the statue of the god itself. So if we read that back here to the White Temple, this would have been the statue of Nana, the moon god, at this particular temple. Now, it's again telling that this is built in that same tripartite plan with the large central hall here and the series of parallel rooms and facilities on the exterior compound, the exterior of the compound, much like what we see with Ubaid domestic architecture. I think it's we can see this as the embodiment, the literal house of God on earth through this complex. We know it was likely a two-storied compound, and you can see here a reconstruction of that compound in the terrace of the White Temple at the Anu Ziggurat. This would have been raised above the rest of the city and would have been visible from the hinterland, the countryside, around the city of Uruk. And in the foundations, we find a series of deposits, in particular of a leopard and a lion, two incredibly important animals in terms of the symbols for the iconography, who are sacrificed, captured, and buried under the floors of this temple as kind of a sacrificial offering for its construction. Now, below the temple itself, there was a series of other structures dating all the way back to the Ubaid period, which suggests a similar type of religious continuity that we saw at the site of Eridu. But most of the excavations focused on the Eanna Precinct. And this is the large elite residential and administrative complex that in the early dynastic period was dedicated to the Sumerian goddess Eanna, the goddess of love and war. What was found in the Uruk period were several successive layers of large storage facilities, elite residences, and temples. These are generally considered elite residences, viewed to be kind of the house of the elite, of the leader, the man in the net skirt, who's represented in Uruk iconography, but also of the priests and religious leaders of Uruk society. So I want to break down here the Uruk period 4 complex, and this is the most well preserved, dating to the late Uruk. And if you click the link up here, you can watch a 3D reconstruction video that was put together by the excavating team today. So some of the key characteristics inside of Warka itself are the limestone temple. This was constructed of limestone blocks that are imported from up to about 50 kilometers away. It's incredibly large. It's built on a niched and buttressed tripartite plan. Again, think of that as the house of the god. And if we view this as the same way as the Anu Ziggurat, this was likely the house of Eanna from within Uruk society. Those limestone blocks themselves are important. Right, they're coming from about 50 kilometers away, so it would have been a massive labor investiture to build this 76 by 30 meter temple out of imported stone. We also see the construction of the pillared hall in this area here. It's a much smaller temple complex, but it's built on a series of terraces and a tripartite plan. And if you kind of look at the archaeological reports, it's painted a bright kind of like egg yolk yellow, so it would have stood out on the landscape, and it was decorated with over 100 different geometric designs that were brightly painted and set into clay cones that were put into the walls in a mosaic form. So you get this kind of, think of Ubaid geometric pottery that we talked about. It's then reconstructed in bright colors on the walls of these complexes. There's also the Rimshin Gaboda. This is a building constructed out of a very specific style of mud brick called Rimshin bricks by the excavators, and it's basically the large storeroom for the temple complexes. It contained hundreds of storage vessels and stone vessels and wooden boxes with stone inlays that were used to house the goods that were flowing into the temple complex, and we'll talk about how that worked in a little bit. Now, in addition to those buildings, we see here in Area E, the central complex is generally assumed to be the palace, a series of storage rooms and facilities surrounding a large central courtyard. Then you have the Great Hall, tripartite complexes and buildings that were built here. They're likely feasting areas or gathering areas based on their size. And then you have the Great Courtyard, which was essentially an outdoor garden. It had a gravity-fed irrigation system, and we can kind of think about it. You see it reconstructed here on this plan inside of the compound as a place for an orchard, most likely of something like date trees, that would have been incredibly important for these large-scale feasts. Now, the walls of the Eanna Precinct were often covered in these baked clay or stone mosaics that were set into the mud brick to create these decorative patterns. And here you can see the faded paints, but you can see the yellows, reds, and blacks that are painted on the ends of these compounds. And this is the reconstruction of these in modern Uruk today, and you can see the faded geometric designs. So we may kind of think of this as kind of bland limestone or mud brick, but the reality is that we're looking at this technique with the mosaics as a way to plaster and paint an extremely vivid landscape that would have drew people's eye and attention through the festivities and ceremonies that are going on and the religious control of the temple in this precinct.